When Alex walked up to the club in his red MAGA hat, he never expected the night to take such a humiliating turn. The bouncer, without even glancing at his invitation, shoved him away, calling him a political extremist. But what if I told you that this fanatic is actually one of the club's biggest investors, and his humiliation led to much more than just a fired bouncer? This is the story that flipped everything on its head. Alexei, a successful businessman with strong conservative values, was looking forward to a night out at one of the city's newest, most exclusive clubs. Tired of back-to-back business meetings and endless negotiations, he just wanted to relax, enjoy some music, and let off steam. His signature MAGA hat was, as usual, turning heads, but Alexei didn't mind. After all, his reputation and status spoke for themselves. However, what he didn't expect was that his night would take a turn for the worse. As Alexei approached the velvet ropes of the club, the security guard immediately took notice of his hat. A subtle shift in the guard's expression told Alexei everything he needed to know. This wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. In Alexei's hand was a VIP invitation, a golden ticket that guaranteed access, but the guard didn't even glance at it. Instead, with a look of disdain, the guard took a step forward and blocked Alexei's path. "Sorry, man," the guard said, his tone condescending. "But we don't allow people like you in here. That hat? It's not gonna fly." Alexei, taken aback, frowned. He had known this club well. It was part of his investment portfolio. He was not some random guy off the street. But still, the guard stood firm, not even bothering to look at the VIP pass in Alexei's hand. "Excuse me?" Alexei asked, his voice steady but confused. "I'm an investor here. This club is part of my portfolio." The guard didn't even flinch. Instead, he shook his head dismissively and waved Alexei off. "Yeah, I don't care. You're not getting in. Take that hat somewhere else." The audacity of the situation made Alexei pause. How was it possible that someone could be so openly discriminatory? This wasn't a random misunderstanding. The security guard had made it clear that he wasn't willing to let anyone like Alexei into the club. Not because of anything he had done, but because of the hat he wore. It wasn't just about the hat, it was about everything that came with it, the political and ideological statement it carried. As Alexei stood there, trying to process what had just happened, he noticed a few people walking by, giving him side glances. Whispers filled the air. "Look at this guy," one whispered. "What's with the hat? Is he trying to start something?" "He's probably one of those Trump supporters, huh? Totally out of touch," another muttered, shaking his head. Alexei's jaw clenched. The whispers were a clear sign that in their eyes, he wasn't just a guy in a MAGA hat. He was a walking target, a representation of everything they despised, and it was clear that these onlookers felt perfectly justified in judging him. Despite his growing frustration, Alexei tried to remain calm. He wasn't about to make a scene. Not yet. He just needed to let things cool down, gather his thoughts, and decide what to do next. But as he stood there, a group of young people, laughing and talking loudly, walked by. One of them caught sight of Alexei and called out with a sneer. "Wow! Political propaganda much? What's next, old man? A speech on the Constitution? Get over it." The insult stung, but Alexei kept his composure. He didn't say a word. He was used to being the target of this kind of treatment, but tonight felt different. There was something about the way they looked at him, as if he were the problem, as if his presence, his views, and even his appearance were inherently wrong. His sense of justice was boiling over, but he still stood there, doing his best to keep his anger in check. He was about to leave, but the way the guard had treated him felt like a personal affront, a symbol of the growing intolerance that had been bubbling under the surface of American society for far too long. A few minutes passed, but it quickly became clear to Alexei that there was no way he was getting into the club tonight. Despite his attempts at remaining calm, the security guard, who had been silently watching him from the moment of their first interaction, approached once again with an expression of thinly veiled hostility. "I told you to leave," the guard repeated, his tone even harsher than before. "You're not welcome here." Alexei took a deep breath, trying to control his mounting frustration. He was used to being the subject of political judgment, but this was different. The man had no interest in listening to his explanation, no desire to even consider the fact that he was an important investor in the very club the guard was guarding. Alexei tried once again to explain himself, though the effort felt almost futile. "I'm one of the investors here," he said, holding up the VIP pass as if it might finally make the guard reconsider. "I have a stake in this club. You can check your list." The guard didn't even glance at the pass. He just shook his head, dismissing Alexei as if he were some irrelevant nuisance. "This isn't the place for people like you," he sneered. "We don't let racists, aggressors, and lunatics in here. You don't belong." The words hit Alexei like a slap in the face. He stood there, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the accusation. Racist? Aggressive? Lunatic? What had he done to warrant such labels? Was it just because of the MAGA hat? Because of his political beliefs? His pulse quickened as a wave of anger rose from deep within him. He had never been called anything like this before, and the unjust nature of it gnawed at him. He scanned the crowd, looking for some sense of support, some indication that others might step in. But the people around him, familiar faces from business events and social gatherings, stayed silent. They didn't come to his aid. They didn't even approach. Instead, they remained on the other side of the door, quietly watching the scene unfold, too afraid or too indifferent to speak up. Alexei's eyes flicked across the crowd, but he saw no one he could count on for support. Their eyes, when they briefly met his, conveyed more embarrassment than empathy. They didn't want to get involved. Just as he began to feel more isolated, a couple walked past him, laughing and talking animatedly. The man, clearly amused, glanced at Alexei and smirked. "Look at that guy," he said, loud enough for Alexei to hear. "A real patriot in a MAGA hat. Maybe we should refund his money if he's planning on standing out here all night." Alexei's face reddened, the insult cutting deeper than it should have. He had grown accustomed to political insults, but hearing it from strangers who didn't even know him, who were so quick to judge based on nothing but appearances, it was infuriating. What gave them the right to define him like that? Who gave them the power to dismiss him with such casual disdain? At this point, Alexei knew he couldn't walk away. He had to stand up for himself, to at least make some attempt to make them see the injustice of it all. He took a step forward, trying once again to move toward the door. But the guard, who had been watching from the corner of his eye, stepped in front of him with a purposeful gesture. "You're not getting in," the guard said, his voice final. "This is over. You can leave now." Alexei paused for a moment, staring at the man who stood in his way. The unfairness of the situation burned through him. The guard wasn't just denying him entry. He was making a political statement. He was saying that Alexei, because of his political beliefs, was unwelcome in this space, despite his actual role and his importance to the club. With a deep breath, Alexei stepped back. He wouldn't make a scene. Not yet. But the seed of injustice had been planted, and he knew that the next steps would be far more complicated. If he left now, it wouldn't be just about him being denied entry. It would be about the principle, about how easily people were judged by their appearance, their beliefs, and their symbols. How easily the people in power dismissed the value of others. As he turned to leave, Alexei couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. The dismissive attitude, the closed-mindedness, the quiet complicity of the crowd. It all felt like a symptom of a deeper societal problem. And Alexei was no stranger to problems like this. He had fought harder battles in his life, and this was just another one. He wasn't about to let it slide. Just when it seemed like all was lost, and Alexei was about to walk away from the unjust confrontation, something inside him clicked. He couldn't leave. Not like this. He had put too much into this club, too much into everything that had gotten him to this point. This wasn't just about a MAGA hat. This was about principle, dignity, and respect. In that moment, Alexei pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. It rang for a few seconds before his old friend, Dmitri, answered. a powerful businessman who owned a chain of upscale restaurants and hotels. The two had worked together on numerous joint ventures over the years, building a strong relationship based on mutual trust. Dmitri was no stranger to high-profile projects, and his reputation carried weight. Alexei spoke quickly, his voice measured but tinged with irritation. "Dmitri, I need your help," he said. "I'm at this club. They've just thrown me out because of my hat." A moment of silence passed on the other end, but Alexei could hear Dmitri's voice grow serious. "Where are you? I'm coming," Dmitri replied with urgency. As Alexei was about to hang up, he looked around and saw Dmitri walking toward him. Dmitri, tall and imposing in his designer suit, had clearly noticed the scene unfolding in front of the club. His eyes scanned the situation, and before Alexei could even say anything further, Dmitri stepped up to the guard with an air of authority that immediately shifted the power dynamics. "What's going on here?" Dmitri's voice was cold, precise, and laced with quiet fury. The guard, still standing in front of Alexei, glanced nervously at Dmitri, unsure of how to respond. The atmosphere had shifted from one of casual indifference to palpable tension. Alexei didn't even wait for the guard's reply. He gave Dmitri a quick rundown of the situation, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's simple, Dmitri. This guy saw my MAGA hat, and now I'm a racist, an aggressor, and undesirable in his eyes. He hasn't even asked who I am or what I've done for this place." Dmitri's lips curled into a tight, controlled smile. He turned toward the guard and addressed him, the sharpness in his tone cutting through the night air. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Dmitri's words were slow, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of authority. The guard blinked, taken aback by the change in tone. He swallowed hard, and his face turned a few shades paler. For the first time, he seemed unsure, fidgeting with the collar of his shirt as if it suddenly became too tight. I didn't know," the guard stammered, his voice betraying his nervousness. I thought you were just some tourist or a troublemaker." Alexei's patience had worn thin, but Dmitri stepped forward, his posture firm and unyielding. "You thought he was just some tourist with a hat?" Dmitri raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with mockery. "Well, now you know better. This is Alexei Ivanov, one of the largest investors in this club. He holds a significant stake in its future, and you, my friend, have just humiliated him." The realization hit the guard like a ton of bricks. His face turned an even deeper shade of red, and for a brief moment, he appeared frozen in place, caught in the suffocating silence of his own mistake. Alexei, who had been standing quietly by, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of incredulity and quiet amusement. He had never imagined that this confrontation would escalate so quickly. His eyes locked onto the guard, who was now visibly sweating under the pressure of Dmitri's words. With a small chuckle, Alexei crossed his arms, leaning against the wall, savoring the irony of the situation. "So," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you thought I was just some old guy with a MAGA hat looking to cause trouble, huh?" The guard stammered, trying to apologize, but the words just wouldn't come. I mean I... He trailed off, the apology sounding hollow and forced. Dmitri didn't let him off the hook. He stepped even closer, towering over the guard now. "You didn't just make a mistake," Dmitri continued, his voice unwavering. "You publicly humiliated a key investor in the very business you're working for. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's people who don't know their place." The guard's face flushed with a mix of shame and fear as Dmitri's words sank in. He stood there, motionless, as Alexei's silence spoke volumes. "You've embarrassed yourself," Alexei finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with the weight of a man who knew exactly how to wield power when it was his turn. "Now you have the chance to make it right. Apologize, and maybe you'll leave this situation with your job." The guard, still reeling from the realization, nodded weakly. He mumbled an apology, but the damage had been done. His tone was lifeless, and there was no sincerity in his voice. He had been exposed for his prejudiced assumptions and his inability to see beyond appearances. Alexei exchanged a brief, knowing glance with Dmitri, who gave him a small nod of approval. This was not about humiliation anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even when no one else was willing to do so. As the guard stumbled away, Alexei's sense of justice flared up once again. Only this time, it was tempered with the satisfaction of knowing that the tables had been turned. But Dmitri wasn't finished. He leaned in close to the guard, his voice low enough for only the three of them to hear. "Next time you judge someone based on a hat, you better make sure you know who they are," Dmitri said, his words a final warning. The guard nodded quickly, clearly understanding the gravity of his mistake, and disappeared into the shadows of the club, leaving Alexei and Dmitri standing in the light. Alexei stood tall, a small smile creeping onto his face. The situation hadn't gone the way he'd expected, but in the end, the tables had turned, and he had come out victorious. "Let's go inside, Dmitri," Alexei said, finally feeling the weight of the night lift. "It's time to show them who really runs this place." As soon as Alexei's true status was revealed, the entire atmosphere in front of the club shifted dramatically. The guard stood frozen, his face flushed with embarrassment, while murmurs rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. People started exchanging whispers, wide-eyed, in disbelief over what had just transpired. They couldn't fathom that the man they had dismissed so casually had turned out to be one of the club's most important investors. But Alexei wasn't the kind of person to let this slide without consequences. His sense of justice wasn't just about getting even. It was about making sure this kind of ignorance and prejudice didn't go unpunished. He was done letting people assume they could treat him however they wanted. "Friends," Alexei said, his voice firm and commanding, carrying across the space for everyone to hear. The crowd fell silent, curious to hear what he would say next. "I'm sure we all value good relations, friendship, and partnership. But let me make one thing crystal clear. If I ever see something like this happen again, we won't just lose a client. We'll lose much more. We'll lose our reputation." His words were sharp, deliberate. Alexei's tone made it clear that he wasn't just venting frustration. He was issuing a warning, and everyone within earshot could feel the weight of it. Turning back to Dmitri, Alexei's voice softened just slightly, but there was still an unmistakable edge to it. "Let's handle this matter," he said. "The security guard, unfortunately, is leaving too bad of an impression for us to let it slide." The guard, clearly overwhelmed by the situation and no longer able to hide his nervousness, stammered his apologies, but Alexei wasn't having any of it. He wasn't interested in excuses. Dmitri stepped forward, his face now as cold as Alexei's, and without another word, he picked up his phone. A few moments later, the club manager appeared, looking somewhat confused, but clearly eager to resolve the issue. Dmitri took the lead. "Mr. Ivanov is one of our largest investors," Dmitri said, his voice like ice. "This is how we treat our investors?" He didn't need to say more. The manager understood immediately. The manager turned toward the guard and dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "You're fired," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. The guard blinked, frozen, as the reality of his situation set in. He had been too quick to judge, and now his lack of understanding, his ignorance and bias, had cost him his job. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence as the guard was led away, his head down, his shoulders slumped. The immediate feeling of discomfort in the air faded as quickly as it had appeared. The balance of power had shifted. Alexei, who had been watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, now turned back to face the small group of familiar faces standing nearby. His look was calm but full of authority, and a small, knowing smile crept onto his face. The moral victory was his. The people who had looked at him with disdain now had no choice but to acknowledge his presence. He was not just another political symbol or figurehead in a hat. He was someone they would now have to respect. He took a moment to glance at Dmitri, who gave him a short, approving nod. The look in Dmitri's eyes was one of quiet pride, not just for the victory, but for the way Alexei had handled the situation. As the crowd began to disperse, Alexei smiled at a few of the people he recognized, his demeanor lightening now that the situation had been resolved. There was no more tension in the air, no more whispers behind his back. He was free to enjoy his evening in peace. No one would dare question his place here again. Turning towards the entrance, Alexei said to Dmitri with a hint of humor in his voice, "Let's go inside, Dmitri. I'm eager to show them who really runs this place." They walked into the club together, heads held high, and were immediately escorted to the VIP area. The staff greeted Alexei with warm smiles, nodding respectfully as they led him to a prime table. There were no more side glances or whispers. The manager himself appeared, offering an apology for the earlier incident, his tone genuine and filled with a touch of embarrassment. As the evening wore on, Alexei found himself relaxing. The music, the atmosphere, the company of friends, it was all he had wanted when he walked in. The injustice he had faced earlier no longer seemed to matter. It was replaced with the comfort of knowing that he had stood up for himself, and in doing so, had restored a sense of balance and fairness. By the end of the night, Alexei was surrounded by people who treated him with the respect he deserved. There was no more pretense, no more judgment based on the color of his hat. The unfairness he'd experienced earlier had been wiped away, replaced by a much-needed sense of victory. Immoral victory, one that tasted sweeter than any drink he could have ordered. In the end, Alexei wasn't just a businessman with a MAGA hat. He was a man who had shown everyone what true strength was. The strength to stand firm in the face of adversity, to demand respect, and when the time came, to deliver a dose of justice, swift and without apology. As he sat back, smiling to himself, he knew that the night had turned out exactly as it should. And as for the club and its management, they would think twice before ever underestimating someone based on their appearance again. Justice had been served, and it had come with a side of sweet, satisfying irony.